The crumpled paper landed in the waste basket with barely a sound, dismissed like so many others before it. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez glanced at the sketch one more time through the wire mesh. Crude lines depicting aircraft formations, wind patterns, and what appeared to be trajectory calculations. The accompanying note, written in careful block letters, suggested optimal attack vectors for the upcoming mission. He shook his head and returned to his coffee, muttering about base kids with too much time and too many war movies. Outside the temporary command post, 10-year-old Kestrel Thorne watched through the window as her drawing disappeared into military bureaucracy. She'd spent 3 hours perfecting those calculations, measuring wind speeds with a homemade anemometer, tracking the daily flight patterns of the F-16s that screamed overhead. Her father, Colonel James Thorne, had taught her to read the sky before she could properly read books. But here, on this forward operating base in the Afghan mountains, she was just another dependent, another mouth to feed, another security concern. The morning briefing commenced at 600 hours. Major Harrison spread tactical maps across the aluminum table while pilots gathered around, their flight suits still crisp in the pre-dawn chill. The target, a Taliban stronghold nestled in the Kunar Valley, intelligence suggesting high-value targets were meeting there within the next 12 hours. The mission parameters were straightforward surgical strike, minimal collateral damage, in and out before the enemy could respond. "Weather's looking dicey," Captain Mitchell observed, studying the meteorological reports. "Wind shears unpredictable in those mountain corridors could affect our bombing accuracy." Rodriguez remembered the sketch then, something about the wind patterns the kid had drawn. He'd seen her measuring things with makeshift instruments, always watching the sky with an intensity that seemed unusual for a child. Her father had died in a helicopter crash 6 months ago, mechanical failure during a routine patrol. Since then, she'd been living on base with her aunt, a medical officer stationed at the field hospital. The briefing continued, but Rodriguez found himself walking back to his desk, fishing the crumpled paper from the waste basket. The drawing was more sophisticated than he'd initially realized. The wind vectors were precisely calculated, the aircraft formations optimized for the terrain, and the predicted strike pattern. It was actually quite brilliant. For a moment, he wondered if the girl had been listening to classified briefings, but then remembered her background. Military brat, raised by a pilot father who treated her like a protege rather than a dependent. As the sun crested the Hindu Kush peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He smoothed out the sketch and walked toward the briefing room, knowing he was about to either make a fool of himself or potentially save lives. The girl's calculations deserved a second look. 23 years later, Brigadier General Kestrel Nighthawk Thorne would remember this moment as the first time someone in uniform took her seriously. But that morning, she was just a kid with a sketch, watching F-16s prepare for a mission that would test everything she thought she knew about the unforgiving mathematics of war. The first jets began their engine startup sequence, twin turbofans whining to life in the crisp mountain air. Rodriguez quickened his pace, the sketch clutched in his weathered hands. Time was running out, and somewhere in the valley below, the enemy waited, unaware that their fate might rest on the observations of a 10-year-old girl who understood the sky better than most seasoned pilots. The Tactical Operations Center buzzed with pre-mission energy. Radios crackled with weather updates, flight coordinators synchronized timing, and weapons specialists conducted final checks on guided munitions. Through it all, Rodriguez pushed through the crowd of personnel, his mind racing with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. Major Harrison looked up from the mission timeline, his expression shifting from mild irritation to curiosity as Rodriguez approached with the wrinkled paper. "Sergeant, we're 15 minutes from launch. Whatever this is, it better be important." Rodriguez spread the sketch across the tactical map, his finger tracing the carefully drawn wind vectors. "Sir, This was submitted by one of the base dependents. The calculations. They're showing something our weather reports might be missing. The room fell silent except for the distant roar of jet engines. Captain Mitchell leaned forward, studying the handwritten notes that accompanied the drawing. The mathematical precision was undeniable: barometric pressure readings, wind speed calculations adjusted for altitude, even predictions for thermal updrafts that could affect guided munitions. This wasn't the work of a child playing with crayons. "Who drew this?" Harrison asked, his skepticism evident but not dismissive. "Colonel Thorne's daughter. She's been observing flight operations since she arrived on base." The name carried weight. James Thorne had been a respected pilot, killed in action 6 months prior. His death had left a void in the squadron, and now his daughter was attempting to fill it with mathematics and intuition. Harrison studied the sketch more carefully, cross-referencing it with the official weather data. "These wind patterns," he murmured, "they're accounting for terrain effects our instruments might not be picking up. She's showing convergence zones that could create unexpected turbulence." Outside, the F-16s had completed their pre-flight checks. Lead pilot Captain Viper Martinez waited for final clearance, his hands steady on the controls despite the complexity of the mission ahead. The target was nestled in a valley known for its unpredictable weather patterns, where mountain winds could turn a precision strike into a nightmare of missed targets and civilian casualties. Rodriguez watched Harrison's face as the major compared the girl's predictions with satellite imagery and topographical data. The convergence zones she'd identified lined up perfectly with terrain features that could create dangerous downdrafts. Her calculations suggested an alternative approach vector that would avoid the worst of the turbulence while maintaining tactical surprise. "Get me the flight leader," Harrison said quietly. "We need to brief him on a potential route modification." The radio crackled. "Viper lead, this is tower control. Stand by for updated mission parameters." In the communications booth, Captain Martinez felt a familiar pre-mission tension. Route changes this close to launch usually meant new intelligence, often the kind that made already dangerous missions exponentially more complex. He'd been flying combat missions for 8 years, had seen weather turn precision strikes into disasters, had lost friends to the unforgiving mathematics of wind and gravity. "Viper lead copies, standing by for updated parameters." Harrison keyed his microphone, glancing once more at the sketch that had emerged from a waste basket. "Viper lead, we have revised approach vectors based on updated weather analysis. Recommend approach from bearing 270 instead of plan 320. Terrain analysis suggests significant wind shear in original approach corridor." Martinez absorbed the information, his tactical mind already running calculations. The new approach would add 12 minutes to the mission, would require additional coordination with ground forces, but if the weather data was accurate, it could mean the difference between surgical precision and catastrophic failure. "Tower control, requesting source of updated weather data. Our instruments aren't showing significant deviations from planned parameters." Harrison hesitated, knowing how his next words would sound over the radio. "Viper lead, analysis comes from alternative observational methods. Recommend treating as credible intelligence pending further verification." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. Martinez was weighing professional reputation against operational safety, standard procedure against unconventional wisdom. Finally, his voice crackled through the radio. "Tower control, Viper lead copies alternative approach vector, adjusting flight plan accordingly." Rodriguez found himself holding his breath, watching the tactical display as the 4 F-16s adjusted their formation and began their modified approach to the target zone. Somewhere on the base, a 10-year-old girl was probably watching the sky, unaware that her calculations were about to be tested in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. The valley waited below, its ancient mountains harboring secrets that satellite imagery couldn't reveal and weather instruments couldn't measure. Only the sky itself held the answers, and perhaps a child who had learned to read its subtle language was the key to unlocking them. As the F-16s disappeared into the morning haze, Rodriguez realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, a military operation being influenced by the observations of a dependent who had been dismissed as just another base kid. The implications were staggering, but the immediate concern was simpler. Would her calculations prove accurate, or had he just jeopardized a critical mission based on a child's drawings? The answer would come soon enough, carried on the wind that only Kestrel Thorn seemed to truly understand. 15 minutes into the flight, Viper Lead encountered the first indication that the girl's calculations might be accurate. At exactly the coordinates she'd marked on her sketch, his F-16 hit a pocket of turbulence that sent his aircraft into a brief but violent buffet. Had he been following the original flight path, that same turbulence would have occurred during the critical moments of weapons release. Viper 2, you feeling this chop? Martinez's voice carried a note of professional concern. Affirmative, Lead. Significant wind shear, bearing matches exactly what Tower briefed us on. The four aircraft adjusted their formation, maintaining precise spacing as they navigated the mountain corridors. Below them, the terrain was a maze of ridges and valleys, each one capable of creating its own weather patterns. The girl's sketch had predicted 3 separate wind convergence zones, and so far, her calculations were proving unnervingly accurate. Back at the Tactical Operations Center, Rodriguez monitored the mission progress on multiple screens. Radio chatter was professional and controlled, but he could hear the subtle tension in the pilots' voices as they encountered each weather phenomenon exactly as the sketch had predicted. Harrison stood beside him, his expression unreadable as he watched the mission unfold. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "the girl's probably watching from the observation deck. She might want to know that her calculations are being taken seriously." Harrison nodded, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. "After the mission, Sergeant, if this works out, we'll have a conversation with young Miss Thorne about her future in military aviation." The F-16s reached their initial attack point, weapons systems armed and ready. The target building sat in the valley below, its walls seeming to merge with the surrounding terrain. Intelligence suggested that high-value targets were meeting inside, planning coordinated attacks against coalition forces. This was the kind of precision strike that could save dozens of lives or, if executed poorly, create an international incident. Viper Lead, target acquired, requesting clearance for weapons release. Viper Lead, you are cleared hot. Wind conditions appear favorable for precision engagement. Martinez lined up his approach, the target centered in his heads-up display. The laser-guided munition would follow a precise trajectory, but success depended on stable atmospheric conditions during the critical seconds of flight. Any unexpected wind shear could push the weapon off target by dozens of meters. The girl's sketch had predicted this moment with startling accuracy. Her calculations suggested that the wind patterns would create a brief window of stability, a momentary pause in the atmospheric chaos that would allow for surgical precision. Martinez found himself trusting mathematics he'd never seen before, calculations made by a child who had learned to read the sky from her father. Viper Lead, weapon away. The guided bomb separated from the aircraft, its fins automatically adjusting for wind conditions as it began its descent toward the target. In the Tactical Operations Center, Rodriguez watched the weapon's progress on the tracking display, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. If the girl's calculations were wrong, if her sketch was nothing more than educated guesswork, the consequences would be immediate and devastating. The weapon impacted exactly on target, its explosive force contained within the building's walls. Secondary explosions indicated the presence of weapons or ammunition, confirming the intelligence assessment. No civilian casualties, no collateral damage, a textbook precision strike that would have been impossible under the originally planned flight path. Viper lead target destroyed. Mission accomplished, returning to base. Rodriguez felt his knees weaken slightly as the confirmation came through the radio. The girl's calculations had been perfect, her understanding of the atmospheric conditions more accurate than million-dollar weather prediction systems. Harrison turned to him, his expression now showing a mixture of amazement and profound respect. "Sergeant, I want to meet with the girl immediately upon our return, and I want a full analysis of her methodologies. If she can predict weather patterns with this level of accuracy, we need to understand how." As the F-16s began their return journey, Rodriguez realized that everything had changed. The military hierarchy that had dismissed a child's observations would now have to confront the possibility that unconventional wisdom could prove more valuable than established procedures. The girl who had been ignored was about to become the most important person on the base. But first, she needed to know that her calculations had worked, that her father's teachings had found their ultimate expression in a moment of perfect precision. Rodriguez headed for the observation deck, knowing that Kestrel Thorne deserved to understand what she had accomplished. The observation deck was empty except for the slight figure standing at the railing, binoculars pressed to her eyes as she tracked the returning aircraft. Kestrel Thorne had positioned herself to catch the first glimpse of the F-16s as they emerged from the mountain valleys, her homemade wind measurement device still clutched in her other hand. She looked exactly like what she was, a 10-year-old girl with an extraordinary gift for reading the sky. Rodriguez approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Miss Thorne." She turned, her eyes bright with intelligence and barely contained excitement. "Did they use my calculations? I've been watching the atmospheric conditions, and the wind patterns shifted exactly as I predicted." "They used your calculations," Rodriguez said softly. "The mission was successful. Your father would be proud." For a moment, her composed demeanor cracked, revealing the child beneath the mathematical prodigy. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. Rodriguez understood that this wasn't just about proving her calculations correct. It was about honoring her father's memory, about continuing his legacy in the only way she knew how. "Major Harrison wants to meet with you," he continued. "He wants to understand how you made those predictions." Kestrel wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, the gesture so reminiscent of her father that Rodriguez felt a pang of recognition. "I just watched and listened. Dad taught me that the sky tells you everything you need to know if you pay attention." The F-16s appeared as specks on the horizon, their twin engines creating contrails in the thin mountain air. Kestrel raised her binoculars again, tracking their approach with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years studying aircraft performance. She could probably tell from their formation and flight characteristics whether the mission had gone according to plan. "They're flying relaxed," she observed. "No evasive maneuvers, no indication of battle damage. The mission was clean." Rodriguez marveled at her ability to read so much from such subtle cues. Military pilots spent years learning to interpret the visual signals that indicated mission success or failure, but this girl had developed the skill intuitively. Her father had indeed taught her well. As the aircraft grew larger in the sky, other base personnel began gathering on the observation deck. Word had spread quickly through the military grapevine. The girl's calculations had been used to modify a combat mission, and the results had been spectacularly successful. There was a buzz of excitement and curiosity, but also an underlying current of disbelief. How could a child have predicted atmospheric conditions more accurately than sophisticated meteorological equipment? Major Harrison arrived just as the F-16s entered the traffic pattern, his expression serious but not unkind. He'd clearly been thinking about the implications of what had occurred, the questions it raised about conventional wisdom, and the potential that had been overlooked in a 10-year-old dependent. "Miss Thorne," he said formally, I understand you have a remarkable gift for weather prediction." Kestrel looked up at him, her expression suddenly guarded. She'd learned to be cautious around authority figures, having been dismissed too many times by adults who saw her as just another base kid. "I just pay attention to things most people ignore." "Your attention may have saved lives today," Harrison replied. "Your calculations allowed our pilots to avoid dangerous weather conditions that could have compromised the mission. I'd like to understand how you developed these capabilities." The F-16s were touching down now, their landing gear absorbing the impact of contact with the runway. Kestrel watched them with the intensity of a professional analyst, noting the normalcy of their approach, the absence of any indication of mechanical stress or battle damage. Her calculations had worked perfectly. "My father taught me that flying is about understanding the relationship between metal and air," she said. "He said that most pilots learn to fight the atmosphere, but the best pilots learn to work with it. I've been studying the patterns here for 6 months, mapping the wind currents, measuring the temperature differentials. The mountains create predictable turbulence if you know what to look for." Harrison exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, both men recognizing that they were dealing with someone far beyond her years. The girl's explanation was sophisticated, her understanding of atmospheric physics more advanced than many college graduates. But it was also clearly rooted in practical observation rather than theoretical knowledge. "Would you be willing to share your methods with our meteorological team?" Harrison asked. "Your approach might help us improve our weather prediction capabilities." Kestrel hesitated, glancing at the aircraft as they taxied toward the hangar. She'd spent months perfecting her techniques, driven by a desire to honor her father's memory and perhaps prove that she belonged in the military world that had become her home. The prospect of sharing her methods with professional meteorologists was both exciting and terrifying. "I don't know if they'd listen to me," she admitted. "Most adults think I'm just playing games." "After today, I don't think anyone will question your abilities," Harrison said with a slight smile. "Your calculations were more accurate than our million-dollar weather prediction systems. That's not something we can ignore." As the F-16s shut down their engines, the observation deck fell silent except for the wind whistling through the mountain passes. Kestrel stood at the railing, her small figure silhouetted against the vast sky, and Rodriguez realized he was witnessing a pivotal moment. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was about to become the most valuable weather analyst on the base. But more importantly, she was about to discover that her father's legacy lived on in ways she had never imagined. The debriefing session took place in the squadron-ready room, a space normally reserved for pilots and aircrew. Kestrel sat at the large conference table, her sketch spread out before her, surrounded by officers who had initially dismissed her as just another base kid. The atmosphere was a mixture of professional curiosity and barely concealed amazement. Captain Martinez, still in his flight suit, studied the girl's calculations with the intensity of someone who had just experienced their accuracy firsthand. "These wind vector predictions," he said, pointing to specific sections of the sketch. "They were exactly right. We hit turbulence at every point you marked, but we also found the stable air masses you identified." Kestrel nodded, her confidence growing as she recognized the respect in the pilot's voice. "The thermal columns are predictable if you track the sun's movement across the valley floor. The mountains create a funnel effect that concentrates the wind energy at specific altitudes." The room fell silent as she explained her methodology, using terms that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of atmospheric physics. She described how she had created her own measurement tools, how she had mapped the daily patterns of wind and temperature, how she had learned to predict the formation of dangerous turbulence hours before it occurred. "Your father taught you all this?" Harrison asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "He taught me to observe," Kestrel replied. "He said that the best pilots are the ones who understand that the sky is always talking, always giving you information. Most people don't listen. Rodriguez watched the faces around the table, seeing the gradual shift from skepticism to recognition. These were experienced military professionals, people who had spent years learning to read tactical situations and assess threats. They were beginning to understand that they were dealing with someone who had developed skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom. "The question is," Harrison said slowly, "how do we properly utilize these capabilities? Miss Thorne, would you be interested in working with our meteorological team on a more formal basis?" Kestrel's eyes widened with excitement and nervousness. "You mean, like a real job?" "Something like that. We'd need to work out the details, but your abilities could be invaluable for mission planning. Accurate weather prediction saves lives." The girl looked around the room, seeing faces that had transformed from dismissive to respectful. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like her skills had value beyond personal satisfaction. The military world that had seemed so intimidating was opening its arms to welcome her unique talents. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I'd like to help keep pilots safe." As the meeting concluded, Rodriguez realized that something fundamental had shifted on the base. The hierarchy that had dismissed unconventional wisdom was learning to embrace it. The girl who had been ignored was becoming the center of attention. And perhaps most importantly, a new model for military intelligence was being born, one that valued observation and intuition alongside technology and procedure. Captain Martinez approached Kestrel as the room began to clear. "Miss Thorne, I want you to know that your calculations probably saved my life today. If we'd followed the original flight path, we would have hit that turbulence during weapons release. The results could have been catastrophic." Kestrel looked up at the pilot, her expression serious beyond her years. "My father always said that flying was about bringing everyone home safely. I'm glad I could help with that." Martinez nodded, understanding that he was looking at someone who had inherited more than just her father's knowledge. She had inherited his sense of responsibility, his commitment to protecting those who served. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was revealing herself to be a guardian, someone whose unique gifts could shield others from the dangers that lurked in the unforgiving mathematics of flight. Over the following weeks, Kestrel became an integral part of the base's meteorological operations. Her unofficial title was weather consultant, but everyone knew she was much more than that. She was the person who could read the subtle signs that sophisticated instruments missed, who could predict atmospheric conditions with uncanny accuracy, who could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. The transformation in how she was perceived was remarkable. Officers who had previously walked past her without acknowledgement now sought her opinions on weather conditions. Pilots would consult her predictions before every mission, recognizing that her intuitive understanding of the sky was more reliable than computer models. She had become, in effect, the base's most valuable intelligence asset. But the change went deeper than professional recognition. Kestrel began to carry herself differently, with the confidence of someone whose abilities were valued and respected. She still spent hours observing the sky, but now her observations were systematically recorded and incorporated into official mission planning. Her makeshift instruments were replaced with professional meteorological equipment, though she often relied on her naked eye and intuitive understanding rather than digital readouts. The other base dependents watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and envy. The girl who had been just another military kid was now sitting in briefings with senior officers, her opinions carrying weight in decisions that affected combat operations. She had found her place in the military hierarchy, not through family connections or formal training, but through sheer competence and unique insight. Rodriguez often found himself marveling at the changes. The crumpled sketch that had landed in his wastebasket had evolved into a comprehensive weather analysis system that was being studied by meteorologists throughout the theater of operations. Kestrel's methods were being documented and shared, her techniques being taught to other weather analysts. The girl who had been ignored was becoming a legend. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kestrel herself. The grief that had clouded her eyes since her father's death was beginning to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. She had found a way to honor his memory while carving out her own identity within the military community. Her father's teachings lived on through her work, protecting pilots he would never meet, saving lives he would never know about. The morning briefings had become almost ritualistic in their inclusion of Kestrel's weather predictions. She would stand beside the tactical maps, her slim figure dwarfed by the adults around her, and deliver analysis that had proven more accurate than million-dollar computer systems. Her voice, still carrying the cadence of childhood, would describe atmospheric conditions with the precision of a seasoned meteorologist. Thermal activity will peak between 1400 and 1600 hours, she would report, her finger tracing invisible patterns across the topographical map. The eastern approach corridor will experience significant turbulence, but the western route should remain stable throughout the afternoon. The pilots would nod, making notes on their flight cards, incorporating her predictions into their tactical planning. They had learned to trust her completely, understanding that her unique perspective could mean the difference between successful completion of their missions and catastrophic failure. She had become their guardian angel, watching over them from the ground with skills that seemed almost supernatural. Major Harrison had initiated formal documentation of Kestrel's methods, recognizing that her techniques needed to be preserved and shared. Military meteorologists from other bases had begun visiting to study her approach, to understand how a 10-year-old girl could outperform sophisticated weather prediction systems. The unofficial consensus was that she represented a new model for atmospheric analysis, one that combined scientific knowledge with intuitive observation. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was becoming a case study in unconventional intelligence. Her story was being shared throughout the military community, challenging assumptions about age, experience, and the value of formal training. She was proving that sometimes the most valuable insights came from the most unexpected sources. But for Kestrel, the recognition was secondary to the satisfaction of contributing to something meaningful. Every successful mission, every pilot who returned safely, every target that was precisely engaged without collateral damage, these were the measurements of her success. She was carrying forward her father's legacy of protection and service, using skills he had taught her to safeguard those who served. As autumn settled over the Afghan mountains, Kestrel's reputation extended beyond the base. Her weather predictions were being requested by other units, her analysis was being incorporated into regional mission planning, and her techniques were being studied by meteorological schools back in the United States. The girl who had been ignored was becoming a military asset of strategic importance. The change in her living situation reflected her new status. She had been moved from the dependent quarters to a room adjacent to the meteorological center, officially designated as Weather Analyst Accommodation. Her aunt, the medical officer, had been initially concerned about the arrangement, but she recognized that Kestrel had found her calling, her way of belonging to the military community that had become her home. The transformation was complete when Kestrel received her first unofficial call sign. Captain Martinez had started referring to her as Prophet, recognizing her almost supernatural ability to predict atmospheric conditions. The name stuck, and soon everyone on the base was using it. She was no longer just Kestrel Thorne, the dependent daughter of a dead pilot. She was Prophet, the weather analyst whose predictions saved lives. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During a routine supply delivery, a package arrived addressed to Prophet, Weather Analysis, Forward Operating Base. Inside was a set of pilot wings, accompanied by a note. From the pilots of the 335th Fighter Squadron, thank you for keeping us safe. Kestrel held the wings in her small hands, feeling the weight of metal and meaning. They weren't official, wouldn't appear on any military records, but they represented something far more valuable: the recognition of her peers, the acknowledgement that she belonged to the brotherhood of those who understood the sky. Her father's legacy lived on in those wings, in the lives she protected, in the missions she helped complete successfully. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent had become indispensable. Her sketches had evolved into comprehensive weather analysis systems. Her observations had become critical intelligence, and her intuitive understanding of the atmosphere had become a strategic advantage. She was no longer just watching the sky; she was reading it, interpreting it, and using that knowledge to protect those who served. As winter approached, bringing new challenges and weather patterns, Kestrel prepared for her greatest test yet. The changing seasons would alter the atmospheric dynamics she had spent months learning to predict. But she was ready, armed with her father's teachings, her own hard-won experience, and the confidence that came from knowing that her unique gifts were valued and respected. The girl who had been ignored was about to prove that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or technology, but with observation, intuition, and the kind of understanding that can only come from truly listening to what the sky has to say. Winter in the Afghan mountains brought a complexity to weather patterns that tested even Kestrel's remarkable abilities. The temperature differentials between valley floors and mountain peaks created atmospheric conditions that shifted with deadly unpredictability. Snow squalls could emerge from clear skies within minutes, and wind patterns that had been stable for months suddenly became chaotic and dangerous. The first major test came during a critical medevac mission. A patrol had been ambushed in a remote valley, with multiple casualties requiring immediate extraction. The terrain was treacherous, the landing zone marginal, and the weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The mission would push both aircraft and crew to their limits, requiring precision flying in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Kestrel stood in the operations center, studying the incoming weather data with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. The computer models were showing conflicting information, their predictions varying wildly based on different atmospheric assumptions. Traditional meteorological analysis suggested that the mission would be feasible for another 2 hours, but Kestrel's intuitive reading of the sky told a different story. "The pressure gradient is steepening faster than the instruments are showing," she reported, her voice carrying the authority that had developed over months of proven accuracy. "We have maybe 40 minutes before the winds become too dangerous for helicopter operations." Major Harrison looked at the official weather reports, then at the girl whose predictions had consistently outperformed sophisticated computer systems. The decision was critical. Delaying the mission could cost lives, but launching into dangerous weather conditions could result in the loss of both patients and crew. "How confident are you in that timeline?" he asked. Kestrel closed her eyes briefly, running through the mental calculations that had become second nature. She could feel the atmospheric pressure changes, could sense the thermal dynamics that were building toward dangerous instability. "Very confident, sir. The mountain waves are interacting with the temperature inversion in ways that will create severe turbulence. We need to launch now or wait for the storm to pass." The decision was made instantly. The medevac crew was scrambled, their Black Hawk helicopter spinning up for immediate departure. Kestrel watched from the operations center as the aircraft lifted off, carrying medical personnel and hope toward a remote valley where wounded soldiers waited for salvation. The first 30 minutes of the mission proceeded according to plan. The helicopter navigated the mountain corridors with practiced precision, its crew coordinating with ground forces to identify the landing zone and prepare for rapid extraction. But as they approached the pickup site, the weather conditions began to deteriorate exactly as Kestrel had predicted. "Dustoff 7-2, be advised we're seeing increasing wind speeds and shifting directions," the pilot reported over the radio. "Visibility is dropping rapidly." In the operations center, Kestrel tracked the mission progress with growing concern. Her predictions had been accurate, but now she faced a new challenge, guiding the crew through conditions that were becoming more dangerous by the minute. The computer models were still showing acceptable conditions, but her intuitive understanding of the atmosphere told her that they were racing against time. "Major," she said quietly, "they need to know that the wind patterns are going to shift dramatically in the next 10 minutes. The thermal inversion is going to collapse, creating downdrafts that could slam the helicopter into the ground." Harrison keyed his radio. "Dustoff 72, be advised that our weather analyst predicts significant wind pattern changes in your area. Recommend expedited extraction and immediate departure." The pilot's voice crackled through the static. "Roger, operations. We're on final approach to the landing zone. Casualties are being moved to the aircraft now." Kestrel watched the mission clock, her heart racing as she calculated the remaining time before the atmospheric conditions became lethal. The helicopter crew was skilled and experienced, but they were operating in an environment where physics could overcome expertise in a matter of seconds. Her father had taught her that the sky was unforgiving of mistakes, and right now, the sky was preparing to demonstrate that lesson with potentially fatal consequences. 30 seconds, she whispered to herself, tracking the invisible countdown that only she could see. The radio crackled with the pilot's report. "Casualties secured, departing the landing zone now." Kestrel felt a moment of relief, but she knew the danger wasn't over. The helicopter still had to navigate the mountain corridors while fighting increasingly violent atmospheric conditions. The thermal inversion was collapsing exactly as she had predicted, creating downdrafts and wind shear that could overwhelm even the most powerful aircraft. "Dustoff 72, you're about to encounter severe downdrafts in Grid Square Charlie 7. Recommend maintaining maximum altitude and airspeed." The pilot's response was tense but professional. "Roger, operations. We're feeling the turbulence now. It's getting rough." In the operations center, Kestrel found herself holding her breath as the helicopter fought its way through the deteriorating weather. She could visualize the aircraft's struggle, could imagine the crew fighting to maintain control as the atmosphere tried to dash them against the unforgiving mountain walls. Her predictions had been accurate, but now she had to live with the consequences of that accuracy. The mission succeeded, but barely. The helicopter landed back at base with stress fractures in its rotor blades and a crew that was visibly shaken by their encounter with the mountain weather. The casualties were delivered to the medical facility, their lives saved by the narrow margin of time that Kestrel's predictions had provided. As the crew shut down their aircraft, the pilot approached the operations center with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "That weather forecast saved our lives," he said simply. "5 more minutes and we would have been in serious trouble." Kestrel nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with her abilities. She had the power to save lives, but she also had the burden of knowing when those lives were in danger. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was now responsible for decisions that could mean the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. That night, as she studied the weather patterns for the next day's operations, Kestrel reflected on how much had changed since her father's death. She had found her place in the military community, had developed skills that were valued and respected, had proven that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods. But she had also learned that, with respect came responsibility, that her unique gifts carried the weight of other people's lives. The girl who had been ignored was now indispensable, her weather predictions incorporated into every mission briefing, her analysis trusted above sophisticated computer systems. She had become the guardian angel of the base, watching over pilots and crew with skills that seemed almost supernatural. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, protecting those who served. The spring thaw brought new challenges and opportunities. As the snow melted in the high mountain passes, the atmospheric patterns that Kestrel had spent months learning began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The thermal dynamics changed, wind patterns evolved, and the predictable rhythms of winter weather gave way to the chaotic transitions of seasonal change. For most meteorologists, this would have been a period of uncertainty and reduced accuracy. For Kestrel, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the true depth of her understanding. The first major test came during a complex air support mission. Ground forces had been engaged in a prolonged firefight with enemy forces entrenched in a series of caves and fortified positions. The terrain was treacherous, the enemy positions were well protected, and the weather conditions were marginal at best. The mission would require precise coordination between ground forces, attack aircraft, and close air support, all while navigating atmospheric conditions that were changing by the hour. Kestrel stood in the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by screens displaying weather data, satellite imagery, and tactical maps. The computer models were showing conflicting information about wind patterns and visibility, their predictions varying wildly based on different atmospheric assumptions. Traditional meteorological analysis suggested that the mission would be feasible, but Kestrel's intuitive reading of the sky revealed a more complex picture. "The thermal layers are unstable," she reported, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had developed over months of proven accuracy. "The melting snow is creating temperature differentials that will affect visibility and aircraft performance. We have a window of opportunity, but it's narrower than the computers are showing." Major Harrison had learned to trust her predictions completely, understanding that her unique perspective had saved lives and ensured mission success on countless occasions. He studied the tactical situation, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. The ground forces needed air support, but sending aircraft into dangerous weather conditions could result in the loss of both pilots and aircraft. "What's your recommendation?" he asked. Kestrel closed her eyes briefly, running through the mental calculations that had become second nature. She could feel the atmospheric pressure changes, could sense the thermal dynamics that were building toward either stability or chaos. The mountain weather was like a living thing, constantly evolving, constantly presenting new challenges and opportunities. "Launch now," she said firmly. "We have approximately 90 minutes before the atmospheric conditions become too unstable for precision air support. The thermal inversion will hold until then, but after that, visibility will drop to near zero and wind patterns will become unpredictable." The decision was made instantly. The attack aircraft were scrambled, their pilots briefed on the weather conditions and the narrow window of opportunity that Kestrel's predictions had identified. As the jets lifted off, their engines screaming in the thin mountain air, Kestrel felt the familiar mixture of confidence and anxiety that accompanied every mission she influenced. The first phase of the air support mission proceeded according to plan. The attack aircraft navigated the mountain corridors with practiced precision, their sophisticated targeting systems identifying enemy positions and calculating optimal attack vectors. But as they approached the target area, the weather conditions began to evolve exactly as Kestrel had predicted. "Falcon lead, be advised that visibility is starting to decrease in the target area," the pilot reported over the radio. "We're seeing thermal disturbances that are affecting our targeting systems." In the operations center, Kestrel tracked the mission progress with growing intensity. Her predictions had been accurate so far, but now she faced the challenge of guiding the aircraft through conditions that were becoming more complex by the minute. The computer models were still showing acceptable conditions, but her intuitive understanding of the atmosphere told her that the window of opportunity was closing faster than anyone realized. "Major," she said quietly, "they need to know that the thermal layers are going to collapse in the next 20 minutes. When that happens, the temperature differentials will create optical distortions that will make precision targeting nearly impossible." Harrison keyed his radio. "Falcon lead, Be advised that our weather analyst predicts significant atmospheric changes in your area. Recommend expedited target engagement and immediate departure." The pilot's voice crackled through the static. "Roger, operations. We're beginning our attack run now. Target area is marginally visible, but we can maintain precision engagement." Kestrel watched the mission clock, her heart racing as she calculated the remaining time before the atmospheric conditions became unsuitable for precision air support. The attack aircraft were skilled and experienced, but they were operating in an environment where physics could overcome technology in a matter of minutes. Her father had taught her that successful missions required perfect timing, and right now, timing was everything. The attack proceeded with textbook precision. The guided munitions found their targets, neutralizing enemy positions and providing the relief that the ground forces desperately needed. But as the aircraft prepared to depart the target area, the weather conditions began to deteriorate exactly as Kestrel had predicted. "Falcon lead, visibility is dropping rapidly," the pilot reported. "We're experiencing significant thermal disturbances that are affecting navigation systems." Kestrel felt a moment of tension, knowing that the aircraft were now operating in conditions that were becoming dangerous. The thermal inversion was collapsing, creating optical distortions and atmospheric turbulence that could disorient even the most experienced pilots. Her predictions had been accurate, but now she had to help guide the aircraft safely home. "Falcon lead, recommend immediate climb to flight level 250, she advised through Harrison's radio. "The thermal disturbances are concentrated in the lower altitudes. Higher altitude will provide clearer conditions for navigation." The pilot's response was immediate. "Roger, operations. Climbing to flight level 250. The mission succeeded brilliantly. The attack aircraft returned to base with all objectives accomplished and no casualties sustained. The ground forces reported that the air support had been devastatingly effective, eliminating enemy positions and allowing them to advance to their tactical objectives. But more importantly, the mission had demonstrated once again that Kestrel's weather predictions could mean the difference between success and disaster. As the aircraft shut down their engines, the lead pilot approached the operations center with an expression of professional gratitude. "That weather forecast was spot on," he said. "The atmospheric conditions changed exactly as predicted. Without that advance warning, we might have been caught in dangerous conditions." Kestrel nodded, understanding that her role had evolved beyond simply predicting weather. She had become a tactical asset, someone whose unique understanding of atmospheric conditions could influence the outcome of military operations. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was now an integral part of the decision-making process that determined mission success or failure. That evening, as she reviewed the day's weather patterns and prepared for the next day's operations, Kestrel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had started as a grieving child with a set of homemade weather instruments, dismissed by adults who saw her as just another base dependent. Now she was a trusted advisor, her predictions incorporated into tactical planning, her analysis valued above sophisticated computer systems. The transformation hadn't been easy. She had faced skepticism, dismissal, and the constant challenge of proving herself to adults who questioned her abilities. But she had persevered, driven by a desire to honor her father's memory and contribute to the military community that had become her home. Her unique gifts had found their proper expression in service to others, protecting those who served. The following weeks brought a series of increasingly complex missions, each one testing Kestrel's abilities in new ways. She guided reconnaissance flights through mountain passes where traditional weather prediction failed. She predicted atmospheric conditions that allowed special operations teams to insert and extract without detection. And she provided weather analysis that enabled precision strikes against high-value targets. Her reputation spread throughout the theater of operations, and requests for her predictions came from units across the region. The girl who had been ignored was becoming a legend, her story shared among military personnel as an example of how unconventional wisdom could prove more valuable than traditional methods. She had challenged the assumptions of a hierarchical system, proving that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she was also creating her own legacy, one that would influence military weather analysis for years to come. As summer approached, bringing new atmospheric patterns and fresh challenges, Kestrel prepared for what would become her greatest test yet. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were planning a major offensive, one that would require precise coordination between multiple units and perfect timing to counter effectively. The success of the defensive operations would depend on accurate weather prediction, and everyone knew that traditional meteorological analysis would not be sufficient. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was about to prove that sometimes the fate of entire operations could rest on the shoulders of someone who had learned to read the sky with the intuition of a poet and the precision of a scientist. Her father's teachings had prepared her for this moment, but now she would have to demonstrate that she could carry the weight of strategic responsibility while maintaining the clarity of vision that had made her indispensable. The summer brought with it a new kind of challenge, not just the complexity of changing weather patterns, but the weight of strategic responsibility that came with her growing reputation. Kestrel had evolved from a curious child with homemade instruments to a critical military asset whose predictions influenced operations across the entire theater. The girl who had been ignored was now consulted on missions that could affect the course of the war itself. The first indication of the coming test arrived in the form of classified intelligence reports. Enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a coordinated offensive, one that would involve multiple simultaneous attacks across a wide geographic area. The defensive response would require precise timing, perfect coordination, and above all, accurate weather prediction. Traditional meteorological analysis would not be sufficient for an operation of this scope and complexity. Kestrel stood in the Strategic Operations Center, surrounded by senior officers whose careers had been built on conventional military wisdom. The map spread before her showed enemy positions, friendly unit locations, and planned defensive responses. But what captured her attention were the atmospheric patterns that would determine whether the defensive operations succeeded or failed. The enemy is planning to use the weather as a force multiplier, she observed, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had developed over months of proven accuracy. They're timing their attacks to coincide with atmospheric conditions that will ground our air support and limit our visibility. But they're making assumptions about the weather that may not be accurate. General Morrison, the base commander, studied the intelligence reports with the intensity of someone who understood that the wrong decision could cost hundreds of lives. He had learned to trust Kestrel's predictions, understanding that her unique perspective had consistently outperformed sophisticated computer systems. But this operation would test her abilities in ways that had never been attempted before. "What are you seeing that our meteorologists are missing?" he asked. Kestrel closed her eyes briefly, running through the mental calculations that had become second nature. She could feel the atmospheric pressure changes, could sense the thermal dynamics that were building toward either stability or chaos. The mountain weather was like a living thing, constantly evolving, constantly presenting new challenges and opportunities. The computer models are predicting fog and low visibility during the enemy's planned attack window, she said. But they're not accounting for the thermal inversion that's building in the valleys. The atmospheric conditions are going to shift 6 hours earlier than predicted, creating a window of clear weather that will allow our air support to operate effectively. The room fell silent as the implications of her prediction became clear. If she was right, the defensive operations could be timed to take advantage of favorable weather conditions, turning the enemy's planned surprise attack into a devastating defeat. If she was wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic. "How confident are you in that prediction?" Morrison asked. Kestrel opened her eyes, meeting the general's gaze with the steady confidence that had earned her the respect of everyone on the base. "Very confident, sir. The atmospheric patterns are following a cycle that I've been tracking for months. The thermal dynamics are predictable if you understand the underlying physics." The decision was made to base the defensive operations on Kestrel's weather predictions. Units were repositioned, air support was scheduled, and timing was adjusted to take advantage of the favorable atmospheric conditions she had identified. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was now influencing strategic decisions that could determine the outcome of major military operations. As the operation commenced, Kestrel found herself in the unprecedented position of having an entire defensive strategy dependent on her weather predictions. The responsibility was enormous. The stakes were higher than anything she had previously faced, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Her father's teachings had prepared her for this moment, but now she would have to demonstrate that she could carry the weight of strategic responsibility while maintaining the clarity of vision that had made her indispensable. The first phase of the operation proceeded exactly as she had predicted. The atmospheric conditions shifted earlier than the computer models had suggested, creating a window of clear weather that allowed Allied air support to operate with devastating effectiveness. Enemy forces that had planned to attack under cover of fog and low visibility found themselves exposed and vulnerable, their coordinated offensive disrupted by precise airstrikes and artillery fire. "Prophet's predictions were perfect," came the report from the forward air controller. "Visibility is excellent, wind conditions are stable, and we have clear targeting solutions on all enemy positions." In the Strategic Operations Center, Kestrel watched the battle unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Her predictions had been accurate, but the operation was far from over. The enemy forces were adapting to the unexpected weather conditions, adjusting their tactics, and trying to salvage their offensive. The success of the defensive operations would depend on her ability to continue providing accurate weather predictions as the battle evolved. The engagement continued for 18 hours, with Kestrel providing continuous weather updates that allowed Allied forces to maintain their tactical advantage. Her predictions enabled air support to operate with precision, allowed artillery to engage targets with accuracy, and provided commanders with the information they needed to make critical decisions. The girl who had been ignored was now the center of a complex military operation, her weather analysis influencing every aspect of the battle. When the enemy offensive finally collapsed, the results were beyond anyone's expectations. Allied forces had achieved a decisive victory, inflicting massive casualties on the enemy while sustaining minimal losses themselves. The coordinated attack that had been planned as a major offensive had been turned into a devastating defeat, largely due to the accurate weather predictions that had allowed Allied forces to maintain their tactical advantage. General Morrison approached Kestrel as the operation concluded, his expression reflecting both professional respect and personal amazement. "Your weather predictions turned the tide of this battle," he said simply. "Without your analysis, we would have been fighting blind, reacting to enemy initiatives instead of dictating the terms of engagement." Kestrel nodded, understanding the weight of what she had accomplished. She had proven that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods, that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she was also creating her own legacy, one that would influence military operations for years to come. The success of the defensive operations marked a turning point in Kestrel's military career. She was no longer just a weather analyst. She was a strategic asset, someone whose unique abilities could influence the outcome of major military operations. Her predictions were now incorporated into theater-level planning. Her analysis was sought by commanders throughout the region, and her methods were being studied by meteorologists and military analysts across the world. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. A week after the successful defensive operations, Kestrel received a package with no return address. Inside was a set of general stars, accompanied by a note, "For services to military meteorology that exceed rank and convention, from those who serve in the sky and on the ground." The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent had become a legend, her story shared throughout the military community as an example of how unconventional wisdom could prove more valuable than traditional methods. She had challenged the assumptions of a hierarchical system, proving that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she was also creating her own legacy, one that would influence military weather analysis for generations to come. As autumn returned to the Afghan mountains, bringing with it the familiar patterns of seasonal change, Kestrel prepared for what would become her final test on the base. Orders had come through transferring her to a new assignment, one that would take her to a different theater of operations where her unique skills were needed. The girl who had been ignored was now being actively recruited by military units around the world, her reputation having spread far beyond the mountain base, where her abilities had first been recognized. The night before her departure, Kestrel stood on the observation deck where she had spent countless hours studying the sky. The stars were brilliant in the thin mountain air, their light unmarred by the atmospheric disturbances that had become her specialty. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point, from a grieving child with homemade instruments to a respected military analyst whose predictions influenced strategic operations. Her father's teachings had given her the foundation, but she had built something entirely her own on that foundation. She had proven that the sky could be read with intuition as well as instruments, that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods, and that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent was leaving behind a legacy that would influence military weather analysis for years to come. As she prepared for her new assignment, Kestrel understood that her journey was far from over. The skills she had developed, the reputation she had earned, and the confidence she had gained would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she was also creating her own legacy, one that would continue to grow and evolve with each new mission, each new challenge, each new opportunity to prove that sometimes the sky holds all the answers, if you know how to listen. The transport aircraft that would take her to her new assignment sat on the tarmac, its engines already beginning their startup sequence. Kestrel gathered her few possessions, including the weather instruments that had become her trademark and the pilot wings that symbolized her acceptance into the military community. The girl who had been ignored was about to begin a new chapter in her story, one that would take her to new skis and new challenges, but would always be grounded in the lessons her father had taught her about reading the subtle language of the atmosphere. As the aircraft lifted off, carrying her toward her new assignment, Kestrel looked down at the mountain base that had become her home. The peaks were shrouded in clouds, their summits hidden by the atmospheric disturbances that had become her specialty. But she knew that somewhere below, new weather analysts were learning to read the sky, inspired by the example of a girl who had proven that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent had become a legend, her story shared throughout the military community as an example of how the most important insights could come from the most unexpected sources. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she was also creating her own legacy, one that would influence military operations for generations to come. The sky was calling, and Kestrel Thorne was ready to answer. Years passed, and Kestrel's reputation continued to grow. She served in multiple theaters of operations, her weather predictions saving countless lives and ensuring the success of critical missions. She developed new techniques for atmospheric analysis, trained other meteorologists in her methods, and became recognized as one of the foremost experts in military weather prediction. The girl who had been ignored had become a general officer, her unique skills earning her respect and recognition throughout the military community. But her greatest achievement was not the rank she attained or the mission she influenced. It was the example she set, the proof that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods, that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she had also created her own legacy, one that would continue to influence military weather analysis for generations to come. The final chapter of her story was written not in the official records or the commendation reports, but in the countless lives she saved, the missions she made possible, and the young analysts she inspired to look beyond conventional wisdom and trust their own observations. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent had become a legend, her story a testament to the power of unconventional wisdom and the importance of listening to voices that might otherwise be ignored. General Kestrel Prophet Thorne retired from active duty with the knowledge that she had changed the way the military approached weather analysis, that she had saved countless lives, and that her father's legacy lived on through her work. The girl who had been ignored had become indispensable, her unique gifts finding their proper expression in service to others. The sky had been her classroom, her father her teacher, and the military community her home. She had proven that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or technology, but with observation, intuition, and the kind of understanding that can only come from truly listening to what the sky has to say. Her story became legend, passed down through generations of military weather analysts who understood that sometimes the most valuable insights come from the most unexpected sources. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent had become a symbol of unconventional wisdom, a reminder that the hierarchy of knowledge is not always determined by rank or formal training, but by the ability to observe, understand, and predict the subtle patterns that govern our world. In the end, Kestrel Thorne's greatest achievement was not the recognition she received or the mission she influenced, but the example she set for others who might be dismissed or ignored. She proved that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods, that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources, and that the sky would always hold answers for those who knew how to listen. Her father's legacy lived on through her work, but she had also created her own legacy, one that would continue to influence military weather analysis for generations to come. The girl who had been ignored had become unforgettable, her story a testament to the power of observation, intuition, and the kind of understanding that can only come from truly listening to what the world has to say. The sky had been her teacher, her father her guide, and the military community her home. She had proven that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or technology, but with wisdom, patience, and the courage to trust your own observations even when others dismiss them. General Kestrel Prophet Thorne's legacy lived on in every accurate weather prediction, every successful mission, every life saved by the kind of atmospheric analysis that she had pioneered. The girl who had been dismissed as a dependent had become a legend, her story proof that unconventional wisdom could be more valuable than traditional methods, and that sometimes the most important insights came from the most unexpected sources. Her father's teachings had given her the foundation, but she had built something entirely her own on that foundation, a legacy that would influence military weather analysis for generations to come. The final entry in her service record was simple: changed the way we read the sky. But the real measure of her achievement was not in the official records or the commendation reports. It was in the countless lives she saved, the missions she made possible, and the young analysts she inspired to look beyond conventional wisdom and trust their own observations. The girl who had been ignored had become indispensable, her unique gifts finding their proper expression in service to others, her father's legacy living on through her work, and her own legacy, ensuring that the sky would always hold answers for those who knew how to listen.